As I'm sure you've heard by now, Leonard Nimoy died today, best known, of course, for originating the role of Spock in Star Trek. And I've been a Star Trek fan since I was probably 5 or 6 years old, if even, perhaps even before that. So whenever something like this happens, it's always tough, especially when it's an actor who was as central, as indispensable to the franchise as Leonard Nimoy was. Original cast members have died before. James Doohan died. DeForest Kelley died. That was tough for me because Dr. McCoy was my favorite character, and I always felt like DeForest Kelley was the best actor of the original series. But you just can't have Star Trek without Spock, and you can't have Spock without Leonard Nimoy. And a lot of people, especially maybe more casual fans, may not realize how much of not just the mannerisms and the outward characteristics of Spock come from Nimoy, but even things like the Vulcan neck pinch was kind of an improv that Nimoy pitched. Instead of having Spock crack a guy over the skull with a phaser, he said, "Why Spock wouldn't do something that violent? He would, he would do something non-violent," and he came up with the nerve pinch, which then became an enduring part of Star Trek. The Vulcan hand salute, the "Live Long and Prosper," he lifted that from something he saw the rabbis do. When he would go to the Jewish temple as a boy, he said the rabbis would hold their hands like this when they were blessing the congregation. That became, again, an enduring part of the Star Trek franchise. And so much of what made Spock a compelling character came from Nimoy's own talents and Nimoy's own humanity, I guess, as a performer. Spock was an example of a perfect marriage between a performer and a character. I don't know if any other actor could have portrayed that character as well as Leonard Nimoy did. And I don't know if Nimoy ever could have been given a character more suited to his talents and his strengths as an actor than Spock. It was the kind of character as written that required an actor who could do a lot by doing not very much. Spock, in his typical persona, was very low key, was very stoic, and of course didn't display emotions, or at least didn't display very big noticeable emotions. I mean, there was one emotion that Spock displayed quite often despite his supposed non-emotional state, and that was irritation. And Nimoy played Spock's irritation so beautifully, particularly in the original series. It was often played for a laugh, and a very subtle laugh. And humor is not something that Star Trek has traditionally been very good at. Star Trek tends to hit humor a little hard, and even in the original series, there were those moments where something funny would happen, and the score would sort of come in and have like the bouncy little Henri-sounding music to really smack you in the face with, "Oh, something cute is happening." But even with all of that against him, Nimoy was able to put across a very subtle performance when Spock would just cock an eyebrow, or McCoy would say something and Spock would just sort of turn away in irritation. It's a magnificent performance, just a wonderful performance. And of course, he also got to frequently play Spock in a more emotional state, because once the writers realized how much fun it was to see Nimoy crack a smile or see Spock act out of character, they all of a sudden were killing themselves to find all of these excuses to write Spock out of character. He was going through the Vulcan mating ritual, Pon farr, and he became more irritable, and he started having some more emotions come to the surface. He was sprayed by some alien spore that brought his emotions to the surface and allowed him to behave more like a typical human with emotional highs and lows. They were always finding reasons in the series for Nimoy to show us a more emotional side of Spock, and a lot of that was a lot of fun. But I still say, as an actor, he came out the best, and he showed his true talents as a performer when he was playing just sort of typical low-key, cold, logical Spock. And his acting talents were actually very much appreciated, even at the time, even in the 60s, when Star Trek was not setting the world on fire, when it was not a hugely rated show, when it was always sort of on the bubble of cancellation. Nimoy received Emmy nominations for all 3 seasons of Star Trek. Again, that's something that I think maybe a lot of casual fans might not realize. But Leonard Nimoy, as Spock in the original Star Trek, was nominated for Primetime Emmys for Best Supporting Actor in a Drama all 3 seasons. That's an incredibly impressive feat when you consider the type of show that Star Trek was, when you consider the time that it was on the air, when you consider the fact that even today it is not entirely possible to take Star Trek seriously as like a serious drama. But Nimoy's work as an actor was impressive enough to his peers in the television industry that he was nominated for an Emmy Award for Star Trek 3 years in a row. That is something that I hope that, even though he didn't win, I hope that was something that gave him some pride, because it certainly should have. He was an incredibly talented actor. And of course, he worked in a lot of other stuff too. He'll always be known as Spock. He played Spock on TV in the movies. He reprised the role for the J.J. Abrams films. He'll always be Spock first and foremost. But he appeared in lots of other movies. He appeared in lots of other television shows. I remember him playing important roles in both versions of the Outer Limits episode I, Robot, in the original Outer Limits series, which of course was on TV before I was born, but I saw it later in reruns, where he played the reporter who was sort of covering the story of the robot who was being put on trial for murder. And then 30 years later, they remade it for the remake of the Outer Limits series in the 90s. And they redid that episode, I, Robot, and Leonard Nimoy again appeared in that episode playing a different role. This time he played the lawyer that was defending the robot. But it was really cool, to see Leonard Nimoy as a very young man in his pre-Spock days in the Outer Limits, and then in a remake of the same story in his sort of post-Spock era, appearing in that same story again and playing a different role. It was always nice to see him sort of stretch his arms out, stretch his legs, show his chops a little bit, to play something different than Spock. And outside of acting, he was an artist. He was a photographer. Everybody knows most people know who are fans of his. He released some albums in the 70s that are mostly kitsch. They're appreciated for their cheesy value. That Bilbo Baggins song that he recorded, and there's a memorable music video for him like sitting on a hillside with a bunch of kids like happily singing this song about the Hobbit. But he was a photographer, an art photographer, and his work was exhibited in serious studios and museums, and he had a very, I think, respected career outside of acting as an artist. He announced just a little over a year ago that he had chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, COPD. So his death, though sad and of course surprising, nobody really expected that it would happen today, but his death was not a huge surprise, because he had announced a year ago that he had this chronic disease, and then just a few days ago he had been admitted to the hospital. So it's not a terrible shock, but then again, it is. I mean, when something like this happens, it's always it's always a shock, and it's always an adjustment. When a famous person, when an artist, when an actor that you've come to admire, that you feel like you've known through their work for your entire life, when suddenly that person is gone and you realize, there will be no more work. It's always a shock. It's always an adjustment. And people, of course, have responded to his death. His castmates have made statements. William Shatner posted a lovely little statement on Twitter. Shatner said, "I loved him like a brother. We will all miss his humor, his talent, and his capacity to love." Other cast members have posted things. George Takei said, "Today the world lost a great man, and I lost a great friend. We return you now to the stars, Leonard. You taught us to live long and prosper, and you indeed did, friend. I shall miss you in so many ways." Zachary Quinto, who inherited the role from Nimoy in the new J.J. Abrams Star Trek films, posted a message online saying, "My heart is broken. I love you profoundly, my dear friend, and I will miss you every day." And even the President of the United States responded to the death of Leonard Nimoy. He released a statement. President Obama said this: "Long before being nerdy was cool, there was Leonard Nimoy. Leonard was a lifelong lover of the arts and humanities, a supporter of the sciences, generous with his talent and his time, and of course, Leonard was Spock." cool, logical, big-eared, and level-headed, the center of Star Trek's optimistic, inclusive vision of humanity's future. I loved Spock. In 2007, I had the chance to meet Leonard in person. It was only logical to greet him with the Vulcan salute, the universal sign for live long and prosper. And after 83 years on this planet and on his many visits to others, it's clear Leonard Nimoy did just that. Michelle and I join his family, friends, and countless fans who miss him so dearly today. Again, that a message from the President of the United States in response to the death of Leonard Nimoy. You know you've done a pretty good job. You know you've led a pretty decent life when the President of the United States can release such a beautiful, heartfelt response in the wake of your death. One of my Facebook friends posted something today asking what's my favorite Leonard Nimoy performance in Star Trek. What's my favorite performance of his as Spock? And there are so many things to think of. There are so many moments you could put forward as such a moment, but I can't think of a Spock moment that I love more than the ending to the episode Amok Time, which is one of my favorite episodes, which is the episode that I mentioned earlier or alluded to earlier, where Spock is in the Pon-farr cycle, where he has to go back to Vulcan to mate every 7 years, and through various plot contrivances, he ends up having to face Captain Kirk in a fight to the death, and Captain Kirk fakes his own death to sort of get Spock out of a jam. You know, McCoy injects him with something and Kirk appears to die. And then Spock returns to the ship thinking that Kirk is dead and is about to tell McCoy to contact Starfleet and tell him that he'll be resigning and he will face whatever punishment he has to face for killing his captain. And then Kirk sort of comes in behind him, awake and well, revived, and Spock sees him, and this moment of elation overtakes him, and his cool, logical facade falls away just for a moment, and he turns Kirk around and grabs him by the shoulders and goes, "Jim!" And then he immediately resumes Spock mode, and he straightens up and he's like, "Oh, I'm very pleased to see you, Captain." And McCoy sort of calls bullshit on him and says, "Well, what was all that emotion we just saw?" And Spock says, "Oh, that was my completely logical reaction to seeing the captain alive." And he was just right down the road from there. He was, "Oh, nope, I'm still Spock." That combination of logic and of emotion, I think, is key. One of my favorite quotes from the Spock character comes from Star Trek VI, one of my favorite Star Trek movies. And it's in the same vein as that sort of mixture, that interplay that you see in that moment from the end of Amok Time of emotion and logic. And it's stated very beautifully in this line from Star Trek VI. It's the scene when Spock is talking to Valeris, the young Vulcan officer that he hopes will be able to take his place on the ship when he retires. And Valeris is saying something to him, and she's like, "But Captain Spock, what about logic?" And Spock sort of shushes her and says, "Logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end." And I've always thought that was an incredibly wise statement. And I mean, in my little corner of the internet, in the atheist YouTube community, we value reason very much, and we should. We value logic very much, and we should. But we should also be mindful that logic and reason are not the only things there are. That we are emotional animals. We are creatures of society. We are creatures of feeling. And that even though it is dangerous to allow those feelings to guide us too much, it's dangerous to turn ourselves and to turn our destinies completely over to our feelings. It is just as dangerous to shut those feelings out. We need them. We can only truly have insight and wisdom and understanding when we call on both our reason and our emotions. And that ultimately was a lesson that Spock was able to teach us. Even though he was the cold, logical, unemotional one, he was the perfect vessel for that lesson. Anyway, everybody says live long and prosper when they're talking about Leonard Nimoy. I've seen people say it so many times today since his death was announced. But how do you talk about the man and his work without saying that. And so I will just close this video by saying that we should all be so lucky to live long and to prosper as Leonard Nimoy did, and that we should all strive to follow the example set for us both by his most famous character and also by the man himself. So live long and prosper, everybody.